and the Region Central Project Team. I am Nancy Reka from Highland Planning, and I will be your moderator for this evening. I'm assisted tonight by Charvi Gupta and Tyra Jones, so feel free to use your chat to reach out to us if you have any trouble with your Zoom. Tonight, you will be hearing about how the project team will be developing and evaluating possible scenarios for mobility in Region Central. And your feedback on this presentation is really important to the development of these scenarios. Our meeting is going to last about 2 hours, and we're going to begin with some presentations, then have a general question and answer period, and then we're going to go into breakout groups to discuss in more detail what we've heard. We'll then come back and just briefly share the findings and wrap up for the evening. So I hope that you're able to stick with us because, as I said, your input is really important. A few notes about our Zoom call tonight. You may have heard the notice just now, this meeting is being recorded. Your cameras and microphones are turned off for the presentations, but they will be on for your breakout groups. If at any time you need assistance with your Zoom controls or you have a question or a comment, please type in the chat box. You will find the icon for the chat in your control bar on your meeting screen. You also can raise your hand by going to the reactions button and choosing raise hand, or if you're on the phone, choose *9. During the breakout rooms, instead of using the chat, we're going to ask you to raise your hand to speak. Okay, so Jeff, if you would like to share our presentation for this evening, that would be great.
I'll do a brief intro if that's okay.
Yes, go ahead, Hal.
I'd just like to welcome you all. Many of you have been part of this process for a while now, and we're getting to a very critical juncture. I am project manager for the study at the Regional Transportation Council, and we've been tasked with building consensus based on an objective analysis to determine some potential projects for this part of the region. It's moving well. I really appreciate your participation. I also appreciate the support of all our elected officials, and I'd offer an opportunity for them to welcome you and provide any comment at this time. So you can either raise your hand, or if you're on the phone, *9 will get you in.
I think we do have Senator Ryan on here. I'm going to ask him to unmute. Senator Ryan, are you there?
I am here.
Oh, hi, there you are. Welcome.
Can you see me also?
Yes.
Well, that's a plus. Thank you everyone for participating tonight. Thank you, Hal, and your team. I've been following this closely. As many as you know, I've been really passionate about this. We all know the mistakes that were made in the 60s on both the Kensington and Scajaquada. We know that they separated neighborhoods. We know that they really helped cement segregatory housing practices, but we also know that nobody was asked back in the 60s if they wanted this in their communities. But I really like the way that the team is approaching this. The whole idea of the region central. For too long, we would think about neighborhoods along the corridor as, Black Rock, Parkside, East Side, Hamlin Park. But this really gives us an opportunity to look at it as just one big interconnected neighborhood. And I really like the work you've been doing to figure out how people use this corridor and how people travel in between and in and amongst neighborhoods. And also, this is the acknowledgement is that the 190 and 8 and the 33, they just have different numbers attached to them, but they're really just all the same highway system. They're linked together. We can't fix one without the other. But I'm really excited that since we started this project, boy, the funding picture has changed, right? We suddenly have an infrastructure bill. We have an infrastructure bill that has a concentration on restoring neighborhoods that were damaged by highways. And we have some in Buffalo. Governor Hochul, recently expressed her support for reimagining the Kensington. So I really like the community input we've been doing, people coming together to listen and to learn. So many people have been participating. It's really a positive thing. But we know that this only works with the community's input, the community's feedback. It was just 3 years ago that the DOT released a plan for the redesign. And that plan was soundly and roundly rejected by the community. And when we rebooted the planning process, we intentionally took the DOT out of this stage and put the GBNRTC in charge, and making sure that we have full impact input from the community, but also doing a real 360 view of this. And boy, I can't wait to hear people's input. And I also can't wait to hear what you come up with. But one thing I'm confident of, it's going to be a thought out plan. It's going to be research based. And most importantly, it's going to be built on community feedback. So really look forward to the meeting tonight.
Thanks, Senator.
Thanks so much. So as I mentioned, we're going to get started with just an overview of the project in general. We're going to talk about how the project team is going to be developing scenarios for Region Central and all the things that go into the planning framework. And we're going to be looking at the possible approaches through 3 lenses: mobility, parks, and economics. Then, like I said, we'll have a general Q&A, and we'll go into breakout groups. And then we'll report back and close up. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn it over to David Dixon from Stantec, leading the project team. David, are you there?
Dave, you're muted, Dave. Thank you for that. Okay, this is the one of the issues of our age, being muted. Thank you, Nancy, yet again. Thank you, Hal, and thank you to the senator. It was gracious of the senator to note that GBNRTC, and I think Hal Morse gets particular credit for this, basically declared Region Central a place. And what is particularly significant about this, not only did it recognize the interdependencies and interrelationships between its very diverse neighborhoods, the extent to which all of Region Central, whether you live in Hamlin Park or Grand Amherst, Black Rock, or Fillmore Leroy, to a large extent sort of rise and fall together when it comes to mobility. They either benefited or they benefit or not from how people move, not just through, but around Region Central. But it also recognizes that for years, issues like the Scajaquada and the Kensington were looked at from a regional transportation perspective. And what GBNRTC and HAL have done here is said, the places that these roads pass through are just as important as the region they serve when it comes to looking at their future. And because, as you heard, I hope you were with us in early November at the last meeting, you heard from my good colleague, Ralph Tenisco, just how much travel patterns have changed. The travel patterns that one might have said, use the term justify, I'll leave that up to to 1950, but to the earlier decisions to build these expressways, the justification in terms of travel patterns is I can't say no longer there, but the travel patterns are so different. It is a very right time to reassess. But what has been so important is we are now not reassessing just in terms of how these expressways, how mobility through Region Central serves the larger region, but what really makes Region Central a great place to live, to work, to study, to enjoy parks, to visit the wonderful institutions that serve and represent all of Buffalo that are housed in Region Central. The good folks, what really enhances the lives and the economic opportunity for the good folks who live here, who are Region Central. Next, please. So with this in mind, as Nancy said, tonight we're really going to look at two things. How we are developing mobility scenarios. In other words, we're going to end up probably with, if you go down 3 lines here, to end up with probably 3 mobility scenarios that will comprise a series of mobility components that we talked about in early November, on November 9th, different approaches to a highway, an expressway, or a boulevard, or other alternatives to the Scajaquit itself, but looking at also a whole series of other mobility issues and opportunities across Region Central, and based on what we have learned from you, the planning framework, which we're also going to talk about tonight, that we've developed from all the information we've learned from you about the opportunities. Let me just say your goals for Region Central, for how to make Region Central a better place to live, work, a more equitable place for everyone, how to restore the wonderful natural features to their full glory that grace Region Central, and therefore all of Buffalo. Somebody has just asked if notes can be made available from the 11/9 meeting, to which I have now referred a couple of times. And Nancy, I will pass that task to you because I can't think of anybody better to make them available.
Yes, we will put those in the chat. They are also available on the Region Central website.
Okay. And probably the thing you'll want to look hardest at is something called the Experiential Guide, in which all of the different mobility components, whether it is the expressway, or a different way to look at the expressway, or a boulevard, or the much finer grain roadway changes, different ways to move through and around Region Central, that together can comprise scenarios are discussed. The mobility scenarios then are based on what we have learned from you, again, about your goals and aspirations for Region Central. Senator Ryan mentioned that much of what we're doing is based on community feedback and research into how people move around, and what kinds of jobs you have, and what the economic and other opportunities are here. And then he mentioned that this is a 360-degree assessment. Well, one of the things we really learned from all of you, and learned from the research we've done, is that we can't look at this at mobility through silos, particular a silo that emphasizes only mobility and not livability, economic opportunity, equity, environmental quality, restoration or reinvigoration of parks, all the things that go into making up quality of life and opportunity and environmental responsibility, and the things we care about for places like, and you care about for Region Central. So we've developed a planning framework that we'll talk about tonight that expresses all the full range of across many lenses of goals and qualities for Region Central. We have all then looked at the Experiential Guide, which is the series of mobility improvements, whether it is an alternative to the expressway, to new roadway connections, or other ways to move around, but anything having to do with ways to enhance, better serve mobility needs in Region Central. We've also looked at planned and programmed projects, transportation projects, that any changes to mobility in Region Central need to relate to. And out of this, we are building mobility scenarios, probably 3 mobility scenarios. This research work is complete. You'll hear about it tonight. The mobility scenarios will be developed that grow out of all this work will be developed during December. We will, and you will be the first to hear about them and how they were developed. We will then evaluate them looking at the goals that you've expressed for, again, everything from environmental quality to livability to equity and a wide range of environmental health, all the concerns that, let me reframe, all the goals you have for a better Region Central, and identify which of these mobility scenarios best achieves these goals. This would be a preferred scenario. And then from this, we will identify a preferred scenario, but then also look at how to refine it, pieces we can borrow from the other scenarios to really develop the best recommended mobility future, I'll call it, the tested, refined, and confirmed preferred scenario that in March will turn into our recommendations for the mobility future for Region Central. Next, please. So another way to look at this is many of you have been involved, and boy, do I salute you. We all do, for 20 years in looking at what to do with the Scajaquada and the Kensington. And I want to emphasize their futures are closely related. One can't look at one without looking at the other. A better Buffalo will result from really developing new futures for both. This has been a bottom-up approach, meaning it starts with all of you, but it's also, we should add, been a non-siloed approach, meaning it's not just about transportation, it's about all the things transportation serves in terms of quality of life, economic opportunity, environmental quality, et cetera. This is a data-driven process. And one of the things I really urge everyone to think back to is you learned about data. How many people, for example, actually travel from one end of the Scajaquada to the other today? Relatively small percentage of those who use it. All that data is available in the notes that Nancy is making available. And this will be a process with very transparent decision making. You're going to know exactly why why we have made the recommendations we have and how those recommendations relate to what you have told us and what we have learned and told you. Next, please. So why don't we begin by talking about how we are building scenarios, and
turn it over to Ralph at that point.
Yes.
There you go. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. For those of you who haven't seen me on previous meetings, my name is Ralph Tenisco. I'm leading a lot of the mobility specific components of this effort. And I think as David and others have laid out, we're getting to the point in the overall process where we are developing things to be tested, right? And we're calling those things scenarios. And we'll be developing 3 scenarios, and what you're seeing on the slide here is what's going to be included in each of those. And we'll test them against each other, and we'll test them against the goals and metrics that we're going to talk about the rest of this meeting. And then again, at the end of the meeting, you're going to get to talk about them as well to make sure that we're on the right track. And they are much broader and more inclusive than I think anything that's happened in previous planning efforts around this corridor, because GB&RTC and the Senator and others have really broadened out the things that we're trying to care about and accomplish here. But all of those things have to come back to, this is the thing that is being proposed. And that's what the scenario framework is laying out. So we will develop 3 complete scenarios because that's what our scope says. And they're meant to be different. They're not meant to be exactly what would happen. They're meant to test different versions of how you might approach what happens on the Scajaquada corridor and in Region Central writ large. And they're going to consist of 3 layers, which we're showing here on the screen. The first and simplest is the stuff that's already happening, right? I'll talk about this a little bit. Already programmed projects, things that have been promised or pledged or funded or committed to by any of the actors in and around Region Central, whether it's the city, the state, an institution, and anybody else. So we're trying to include that. The second layer is supporting elements. And here's where we are much broader, right? And we'll show you some examples of this, but these are all the other transportation and mobility and non-mobility things that you may do in Region Central. So they'll include things, and I'll talk about them as specific as put bike lanes here or increase transit service by X. And they are meant to test how, and to broaden out the range of things that might happen here and see how well they're accomplishing the things that we care about, which are our goals, which we're going to talk about. And then the third sort of more detailed layer is what happens in the corridor itself, right? And I'll get through this in a little bit more detail on subsequent slides, but in the corridor, we're talking about the alignment and operation of, is there a road? What kind of road? How big is it? How does it function? How do you cross it? How are the open space and trails and ped and bike accommodations happening near that, right? These are the things we are building towards and we'll present back to you as 3 scenarios, in a little bit of time. Why don't we go to the next slide? So layer 1 is already programmed projects. So you may have seen in previous meetings, we did summaries of all the past plans. We've looked at all of the thinking that's happened in and around Region Central and the things that are committed to, right? Things that are in construction right now, things that are in financed plans that are going to happen in the near future. We've cataloged and mapped all of those here, right? And all this material certainly will be available, following the meeting. And it'll be the baseline of, what's included in all of the various scenarios. But, we're showing you here all the different types of things that are going to happen, right? So intersection improvements, bus shelters, bicycle facilities, some of the existing transit routes. We know NFTA is in the process of, improving their route structure. And we're going to include all of that in our baseline assumption so that when we test what else is needed in Region Central, it's built on the things that are already planned and programmed. We don't want to reinvent these things. We want to build from them. And if you can go to the next slide, Jeff. It's not just a map. There's a matrix. And it's got a list essentially of all the things that are on the map. And it's talking about where they're programmed, a time frame if we have it. And these are things that let's be clear, these are not things that this project is working on or recommending. It's things that this project is acknowledging are happening, right? And again, for many things, you'll see we're repeating it in this way where we're categorizing them by mode. And some things are multimodal because they accommodate many different types of travel. And then there are others that may be more specific to transit or walking or bicycling. And if you go to the next slide, also for driving or roadways. We tried to be as exhaustive as we could and have been coordinating with all the various agencies and stakeholders that are happening here, right? So that's the first layer, right? And we think this is pretty complete. If we're missing anything, from any of the actors, then we want to definitely include it here because we don't want to rethink stuff that's already being done. Let's go to the next. Jeff, thank you. The second layer, as I said, is supporting elements. So in addition to what the design approach on the expressway corridor is, and those of you who are watching can see my hand motion going east to west where the corridor is, effective mobility and all the other things that we're trying to pay attention to, including parks and land use and economic development and equity, all of those things beg a whole series of other additional improvements. Some of them are going to be physical, some of them are going to be policy. And what we're doing is we're cataloging all the things that might be. Many of them have come from previous plans, that were recommended but aren't already programmed for implementation. And others that we've developed as a team because we've heard them from you, or because in our work of looking at how mobility and other things function in and around Region Central, we've recognized that there's a need to test these elements, right? There may be elements that are included in every scenario, and there may be elements that are only included in one scenario, because if you were to do this to the expressway, you might want to do that to something else in the larger Region Central. So what you're seeing on the screen here is a list of the categories that we're developing, that we are developing individual elements of. All right, and Jeff, if you go to the next page, there's an example, right? So here, if we're talking about bicycle infrastructure, and there will be matrices like this for each of those categories. For anybody who thinks we're not being exhaustive enough, you can go through all the matrices. But here we're saying these are other individual projects that may or may not be included in any of the scenarios. So, basically trying to create a menu, and then we will apply and choose from that menu for each of the scenarios. So here, I promise I'm not going through every one of these on this call. We're just showing you an example of the list of bicycle infrastructure, and Katrina, who's sitting here with me. This is not the complete list, is it?
There's more bicycle.
This is one page of the list of bicycle infrastructure that is being considered for the supporting elements of the scenario. And all of those will be undergirded by, you can go to the next slide, Jeff, essentially how we think about the Skagway corridor itself. And what we really mean here is the current expressway and, 50, 100 feet, the expressway in the creek, and then 50 and 100 feet probably to either side of it, where we will have to make, a kind of a more detailed assessment at a planning level, right? Not a full design, but a planning level assessment of what we might do to the Skagway corridor so that we can test it in the scenarios. And let me be clear, there will be 3 scenarios. They will each propose something different as an approach to the corridor. That is the purpose of doing the scenarios, right? So we can see if you were to do something that looks like this, and it has all the other elements around it, this is how it would accomplish the goals that we're going to talk about in a little bit, right? And so we might take 3 different design approaches, that are meant to examine the potential implications of each of those design approaches. What else is needed to make them happen? And then how well do they accomplish the things that we have cared about here? So I think we can certainly talk more about this in the Q&A session. Nancy, I'm not following the chat here, so if there's anything that you need us to address right away. Otherwise, I think we're going to go back and, what I just described here is where we're going, right? We are going to develop those scenarios. They will be mapped. They will have documentation behind them and say, these are the things that are included in here. And they will be developed to the level at which we can evaluate them. And we're going to talk about how we're going to evaluate them next. But that is where we're going over the next few weeks. So I think I'm gonna turn it over to the next section.
Yes, thank you, Ralph. And we have had one question that we can address when we get to the Q&A, which will be coming up in a little bit. And otherwise, I think I've addressed in the chat where you can access information from the last public meeting, including the mobility experiential guide, which is on the website.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to very quickly, and again, I'm David Dixon. I forgot to do what Ralph did and actually introduce myself. The pleasure and honor of working with all of you to lead this team. So now we're going to shift to the planning framework that is built from what we have learned from you in countless interviews and just group conversations and discussions. And what we have read about what you have said over the last year, and in some cases 20 years, and the data that has been collected, the other research we've done, which we've talked about, all of this has gone into developing a planning framework, which it initially is used to develop the scenarios. What do we want to achieve to create a better Region Central? Therefore, what scenarios, what mobility changes might we need to achieve these better outcomes. And then in turn, when the scenarios are in place, we're going to come back and look at all the goals and the metrics that fall out of these goals that we develop to shape a planning framework, and use these to evaluate the scenarios. How well does each scenario do when looked at collectively in achieving each of these specific goals? So tonight, what we're going to talk about is what the primary goals are and the metrics that that really translate these goals into effective strategies for both shaping a mobility scenario and in turn evaluating it. But I want to come back by way of introduction again to the senator's comment that this is, I just loved, that this is a 360-degree assessment. So while we are looking at how we can maintain effective, not just regional mobility, and not just maintain, enhance, maintain, and/or enhance, but also improve and enhance, improve local mobility in and across, within and across Region Central. Not just look at Region Central as a place in service of regional mobility, but how do we look at mobility from a full regional and community perspective? Also, in terms of, I'm going to use the term nature, the replenished parks, parkways, waterways, special places, the Olmsted legacy that you've all talked so much about, no matter who you are across this community, and from the perspective of inclusive economic development. How do we make Region Central a place that provides better economic opportunity, no matter who you are, what your education is, what your professional or work goals are in life? That was not meant to be a joke, but thank you anyway. No. Then, so we're going to talk about how each of these lenses can be expanded into sort of goals, and the goals in turn into a series of specific metrics. And if that laugh implied a question, please go ahead and ask me. But if not, we'll go ahead.
Right. Actually, I'm asking you all to hold your questions until our Q&A, where we'll have time for clarifying questions. But if you do have a question now, please go ahead and type it in the chat. Meanwhile, we're going to press on ahead and go back to Ralph for an introduction to the mobility lens.
Hi, it's me again. So I think what you're going to see here, as David was showing, is for those three main categories, a similar rhythm of how we're going through it at this point. So I talked about the scenarios. That's what we're building. Those are the things that are going to be tested / evaluated. What we're talking about now is how we're going to evaluate them. So for mobility, the term we're using here is effective local and regional mobility. And what we're showing on the slide is what we think we mean by that. And by we, I mean the process to date, which includes all the input that we've gotten from all of you and others, through this study or through previous pieces. So just to put some words to it, our goal here, the lens, the purpose is to ensure that people traveling within, to, from, and through Region Central can do so efficiently, comfortably, and with options other than driving, right? We need to be proactively thinking about all of the ways that people travel that support equity and accessibility. And we've defined those further into three goals here, which, the main version of them are access, choice, and character. I'm going to talk through each of them starting on the next slide. So access. What do we mean by the word access? You hear that a lot in these kinds of studies. So we put real words to it. It means access to destinations in Region Central, access to destinations outside Region Central, from Region Central, and then connectivity between neighborhoods here. And then what we're showing on the right are just in the blue text here, and certainly on the graphic, are some observations that we've made in the study to date about how that works today. right? Many of the numbers in here and the statements are things that we pulled directly from the previous work that we've done and shown you through this process, including the mobility experiential guide. Just some interesting takeaways, right? And we looked at some of the top destinations in Region Central, and surprisingly, most of the drivers that are getting there are actually getting there not using the expressway, they're using local roads. You know, we've absolutely identified that the limited number of crossings of the expressway and the creek and other parts of Region Central funnel vehicles to some of those, you know, those north-south cross streets, you know, in a way that, you know, is impacting how they operate. And then the last piece is, you know, the expressway acts as a barrier. We've presented numbers that show that most people stay on one side or the other side of the expressway and the creek. They don't travel as much. And lastly, that, you know, work trips are a small number of all trips in the neighborhood and on the expressway. So making sure that when we're planning for what mobility needs to look like, we're thinking about all of the ways that people travel to all of the things that they travel to. It's not just going to get to work 3 minutes faster. It's going to get to the doctor or my mom's house or the grocery store or my friends or anything else, you know, or to school or anything else that I might be looking to do. And if you can go to the next slide, that's great. How do we measure access, right? And that's what these metrics are. And we'll use that word metrics a lot. And that's what we're trying to say here is when we develop those 3 scenarios and we think about have they accomplished the things we care about with access, these are the ways we're going to say how well they did or did not do that. You know, these may get altered slightly. You know, we'll certainly talk about them today. We may want to add or subtract or combine some of these things as we move forward, but this is our best understanding of the way to measure this at this point in time. If you go to the next slide, Jeff, you know, so I mentioned 3 kind of major categories here. So access and then choice, right? So not just can I get there, how can I get there? Do I have options for how I may get there? And again, very similar. So what do we mean by that? You know, is in the little box there, multimodal connectivity, first last mile, which is really like, even if I can get there on a bus or I have to park in a parking lot or what does it look like in that last stretch from wherever, you know, the point where I become a pedestrian to the other things that are there. And then this is really also where we're bringing in, we spent a lot of time talking and we'll continue to about next generation mobility, smarter mobility, the whole world of autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles and all the other supporting elements, you know, your scooters, your bike share, and all the other things that come into play with that. And then again, on the right side here, some observations. And I won't read them all, but just as an example, when we looked at all of the trips that people take and all of the ways that they take them, 35% of all trips in Region Central are pedestrian trips, right? And yes, we're looking at the Skagit corridor, but we're looking at mobility in Region Central writ large, and those are things that need to be accommodated. And 62% of driving trips, right? People that drive in Region Central, every trip that started somewhere in the map that we showed you to go somewhere else, almost 2/3 of them are only going less than 5 miles, right? So those are trips that have the potential to be taken in other ways, right? If you had the right kind of choice, right? And let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about what those metrics are. So how are we measuring if the scenario is accomplishing, you know, or providing choice for people? You know, these are some of the ways that we're gonna evaluate those scenarios. Some of it's just in miles. We've added all this new stuff, you know, that provides choice to more people. You know, transit is now covering a larger, you know, in this scenario, transit would cover larger, you know, a larger area, or more people would have better ability to use that. And then how you might change various travel patterns today. And certainly here as well, we'll do some readiness assessments and thinking about next generation mobility. Let's go to the next slide, because the last piece is, you know, there's access, there's choice, and then there's character, right? All of the roads And all of the facilities that we're talking about in Region Central, are part, they're public infrastructure, right? They're inviting or they're not inviting. They're comfortable or they're not comfortable. They're a place you want to be or they're a place that you avoid for various reasons. And again, what we sort of mean by that is in the box. I think very clearly we've heard through all the processes in the past is minimize the expressway and the creek as a barrier between neighborhoods. Can we create effective and inviting front doors for all of the things that are happening in Region Central and all of the things that we want to happen in Region Central? And then again, just some observations on the right where we've looked fairly deeply at safety issues and delay issues and character issues, kind of in and around the Region Central area. And then let's go to the next slide, because how we'll measure that here, we're talking about safety issues, we're talking about street character assessments, things like, do we have wide enough sidewalks? Are there enough pedestrian crossings? We might continue to integrate with some of the other lenses that we're talking about here and think about, street trees and other elements that really make, all the places in Region Central the kind of place where, you feel invited to be in, as opposed to a place that you might want to avoid in all the ways that you travel. So we are definitely digging into all of these in the breakout sessions later. We'll bring them back up when we have those discussions, so we'll be able to dig into them a little bit more, and I look forward to all of your feedback. And I
Thanks
think
a lot, Ralph.
parks, yes.
Okay, now we're going to turn it over to Mike Godfrey from Fisher Associates to talk about parks.
Thanks, Nancy. Nice to be here tonight. Good to see a lot of people in this meeting. So this lens is called Replenished Parks, Parkways, Waterways, and Places. Quite a lot in there, so we're going to unpackage that over the next couple of slides. And the reason this lens exists is fundamentally because this is what we've heard from community engagement, both for this project and before this Region Central project. So for some context, off to the right are some images that show how some of these areas have changed over time. And there's going to be several more current and historic images on the following slides. So in brief, to ensure everyone understands what this lens will and will not do, we have this lens purpose statement, and I'm actually going to read this because it's pretty important. So it's to ensure that future mobility investments in this area, in Region Central, take into consideration the area's rich heritage and efforts to replenish culturally and environmentally significant elements that enhance our city and society for both today and the years to come. So some of you are probably wondering, well, what does this word replenish mean? What does that actually mean? So just to look at definitions from the dictionary, it's to make full or complete again, to fill or build back up again, to restore to a former level or condition. However, we're not suggesting that we completely recreate the past. After all, our city and society has changed quite a lot. Not just in transportation, but in the ways we live, how we live, where we live has changed significantly since the park was originally designed about 150 years ago. For example, we now have recreation in Delaware Park, and that was not part of the original design. We have tennis courts and basketball courts, and these are things that our current society really value as part of our parks, but wasn't part of the original design. So the opportunity for us here is to dive into what it means to replenish, what does the community want replenished, so that we can then evaluate mobility scenarios and focus on infrastructure that can coexist with all these other efforts to replenish our parks, parkways, waterways, and neighborhoods. So we have three categories here. That's the one on the bottom left. So we're going to talk about identity and heritage, natural assets, and then park systems and neighborhoods. Next slide. So I'm actually going to start with the pictures over on the right. So I personally have seen the picture in the upper right several times, but I was pretty struck when I then tried to find an angle using a current aerial so then I could show the comparison of change over time. And I was very struck by the change that has happened in the past 80 years. It really struck me. So we're looking at the past for some very important reasons. And so there's a concentration here in Region Central of the multiple neighborhoods in Region Central of cultural, historic, natural, and neighborhood assets that really give a sense of identity and connection to Buffalo's heritage. The issue is that over time, that sense of identity has been slowly eroded, demolished, significantly altered. Even if people who don't, people that haven't experienced it for themselves because it was, say, demolished or altered 80 years ago, 90 years ago, 100 years ago. When people find out what used to be here, what used to be part of Region Central, how people used to live, and then they think about the ways they want to improve their own neighborhoods. They're taking inspiration from these things in the past. So just there's a couple of things listed here, and we're going to go into this more in the next slide. The significant alteration and removal of Humboldt Parkway, the removal of some of the existing park roads and paths, and the roads and paths that connected both the Meadow side and the Gala Lake side, now called Hoyt Lake. There was a lot of loss of parkland, creekland, habitats, and then significant alteration of Gala Lake. And we're showing these things on the next slide. So next slide, please. So not a lot of people are familiar with it, but where I'm gonna start on the upper left is over time, Delaware Park was expanded a little bit to the west to Grant Street. That was through widening of the creek and through also the construction of the Scajaquada Parkway South. And it's called South because there was planned to be a north. And this was then linking up the neighborhoods to the west to Delaware Park. That parkway was converted, altered, however we want to call it, for the construction of the expressway. Some other major changes are shown here in pictures. So we have all the changes that happened to the Erie Canal and the Black Rock Harbor. Those were demolished for the construction of Interstate 190. There's the picture in the upper right, which is the width of Scajaquada Creek between Elmwood and Grant Street. Lower left is the Humboldt Parkway before the expressway was constructed. And then just to the right of that is the Gala Lake Islands. There used to be several islands in Gala Lake, along with beaches and little harbor areas, and it was very interesting. So to illustrate some of this stuff, we have the map below. So the light blue areas used to be water at some point in time. Different points in time, but at some point in time, they used to be water. So that includes the wide area of Scajaquada Creek on the west and the Gala Lake water bays and areas and islands towards the east. The orangish sort of opaque color is areas that used to be part of the park, solely for the park, but are not now for the park because of the construction of the expressway. And then the areas in green, just to show for context, are the recreational facilities that have been added over time. Next slide. So it's not all about the past. We're also, let's look at the present, because there's a lot of stuff going on. So even though we don't have some of those things that I just mentioned, it's still an amazing place, Region Central. People still flock to Delaware Park, to walk along the creek, to go to the museums, to go to the educational institutions, to go to the zoo. It's really an amazing place. And there's a lot of improvements that are being made in this area that we are taking into consideration. So there's park facilities that are being renovated, improved. There's historic buildings that are being renovated, restored, expanded, such as the Albright Knox Art Gallery, Buffalo History Museum. There's a lot of tree planting and habitat restoration. There's a lot of focus on community goals and expectations looking at this. And there's a lot of improvements at the zoo facility as well. Next slide. So we took all of this information, there's actually a lot more. We pared it down for this presentation, and we started building metrics on all these things that we need to consider as we start looking at these mobility scenarios. So how can, that scenario restore the network of park roads and sidewalks? How can it restore degraded or lost historic features? How can it restore parkway quality, character, and continuity? We're going to talk about more of that later. The ability to facilitate multimodal connectivity between all these different places, the museums, the schools, the zoo. Ability to facilitate restoration of Skagakwada Creek, the alignment and the shoreline of Gala Lake, and the ability to maintain or bring back parkland acreage and the habitat areas. Next slide. So the next one is replenishing our natural assets. So I want to briefly describe why, and we've got some images to help with that. Basically, there's been a significant amount of contamination over time. Now, this is 100 years ago with industrial activities, going all the way up to today with storm sewer events where raw sewage is dumped into water bodies because the systems can't handle it when there's too much rain. So there's been contamination, also significant human alterations. So the image in the upper right is of the western portion of Skagakwada Creek. Now, if you remember earlier, there was a much larger water body there. That water body was filled in part with garbage, dirt, debris, and also industrial waste from the metal manufacturing buildings next to it. As a result, there's a lot of destroyed habitats, nesting areas, issues with flooding control, issues with continued contamination leaking out into the water, affecting the water quality, health, biome, all of that going on. In order to control some of the garbage that's coming down the creek, there are water barriers and grates and dams to try and collect that, but it's also affecting the ability for people to recreate up and down the creek. And suffice it to say, there's a huge direct impact to wildlife, both within the creek and around the creek, and then subsequently down the Niagara River. So the image in the lower right is some of the garbage that comes down Skagakwada Creek. Now, a lot of this is just blown around in the wind, unfortunately. It happens in almost every single neighborhood. But when it winds up in the creek, it starts to break down, it collects, it causes a lot of issues. The image on the lower left is unfortunately two little ducks, not sure if you can see it, but unfortunately they're paddling through one of the CSO events where sewage is dumping into the creek. Next slide. So not to belabor this point, but the images on the right are a series of diagrams showing how the creek has changed over time, how large it used to be, how much it's been channelized, and actually portions of it go underground around Hoyt Lake through Delaware Park. Over on the left is an image that is from the channelization and burying of Skagakwada Creek. And the bottom left is showing the width that Skagakwada Creek used to be. This is about the 1920 diagram over to the right. Next up. So again, looking at what's happening right now, because we're not just looking at the past, there are a lot of projects being done to improve water quality, to stop the garbage and debris from entering the creek. A lot of things going on. So in Forest Lawn, there was a project recently completed to improve the floodway and also some habitats. There's a project over on Niagara Street near the International Bridge is looking at habitat restoration. And Delaware Park itself is doing a lot of habitat restorations, or specifically the perimeter woods. When we were collaborating with a lot of different people, we had the conversation about, well, what do you need in the future? What are you looking to do in the future? And many times it came back was, we just need a decision on the expressway so that we can continue our planning for restoration and cleanup of the creek. That was pretty interesting and kind of profound. In addition, there's some dredging that is needed to clean up some contamination, some riparian restoration, which is the sides of waterways, cleanup of adjacent contaminated land, Hydrologically, the creek needs to be wider for flooding events, reconnecting the creek and the lake together to also restore that hydrological function. And then, very importantly, looking at green infrastructure, so that way the future infrastructure doesn't put in contamination into the creek and the lake. Next up. So we have our metrics here from everything we just talked about and more. In brief, it's looking at restoring the park and creek ecology, such as landscape patterns, plantings, habitats, restoration of historic hydrological function, facilitate reconnection and restoration of the hydrological function of Scadequida Creek and Hoyt Lake, improving water quality, introducing green infrastructure, and facilitating cleanup and reuse of brownfield and vacant/industrial land. And there is some of that definitely on the western side of the study area, right adjacent to the creek and the highway. Next up. So the last part of this lens is looking at our park systems and neighborhoods. So in brief, the original park, Delaware Park, was actually part of a much larger system. This system of parks and parkways enabled people to travel throughout the city in a park setting. So it connected the east side, the North Buffalo, and the west side, and even the Elmwood Village. It connected all of these different areas up together. Unfortunately, what has happened over time is that direct connection has been altered. So specifically in Delaware Park was kind of the linchpin between the east and the west side. That there was a road in Delaware Park that went from Lincoln Parkway over to Humboldt Parkway and vice versa. That was a multimodal road. It was for pedestrians, bicyclists, cars, and yes, horse and buggy. It was an old road. That has been altered. So now the expressway is specifically for automobile travel. No horses on the expressway. And the pedestrians route is rather kind of convoluted, and you have to walk through a parking lot, and then Humboldt Parkway, once you get there, doesn't exactly exist anymore. However, there have been some improvements. So there are a lot more multi-use trails than used to exist. The Jesse Kriegel Pathway, just to name one, that connects up to the Niagara River. It goes along the Scadequida Creek and then to many other communities. One of the things we've heard a lot is there is a need to connect our neighborhoods more to those paths, connections to those paths. Next slide. So our metrics for this section is to look at restoring Delaware Park's role in connecting the Olmsted Park system. So that's between Lincoln Parkway and Humboldt Parkway. Improving access and recreation for Scadequida Creek, being able to get to the creek and use the creek. To introduce new and improved multi-use paths and connections to the water, to neighborhoods, et cetera. Maintain or facilitate additional active recreation facilities, and ability to mitigate or reduce the level of traffic that funnels off the expressway into our neighborhood centers. So this is more of a traffic related one, but there has been impacts to neighborhood centers by the amount of traffic in them. So that is one thing we are looking at as well. Off to you, Nancy.
Okay, thanks so much. All right, we have one more lens to go through before we get to our Q&A. Thanks so much for bearing with us with all of this information. Just to let you know that this presentation and the notes from this meeting will all be available on the GBNRTC website. The presentation within the next couple of days for sure. So don't feel like you have to get everything right now. Now we're going to go to the inclusive development lens, and I'm going to turn it over to Dina for that. Dina?
Thank you, Nancy. Good evening, everybody. I'm Dina Belzer with Strategic Economics, and I've had the privilege to work on this lens, which we're calling inclusive development, inclusive economic development. But this is really ask the question about how future mobility investments in Region Central will support job accessibility, housing stability, and improve health outcomes for people who live in Region Central, but also people who work in Region Central who might not live here. We want to really acknowledge that commuters are a part of this story. but they're not the whole story, as Ralph said earlier. What we're thinking about here, and a lot of this reflects, again, the conversations that we've had with many of you, the reports that we've reviewed, and our own knowledge and understanding based on data analysis we've done ourselves. That we're really thinking about job growth. Region Central, although this is sort of a new geography within Buffalo, as it stands, it's actually a really important employment center within the city, and has the potential to become even more so a complement or the other end of a dumbbell to downtown. We want to really be able to see the ability to connect local residents and, again, commuters to the jobs that are in Region Central today, and that could be there in the future. And we think of this connection both in terms of physically being able to get there, but also that we want people who live and work in Region Central to be able to access the jobs there, regardless of what their skills and levels of educational attainment are. We want to be sure that housing is of good quality and that is affordable, so that vulnerable households who live in the area today will not be displaced by future investments. I'm going to come back to this point in a minute. We have neighborhoods that are safe and healthy, and I think Mike and Ralph have already really touched on some of those issues, but I want to underscore them. Really, when you see our three presentations today, I hope you do get the sense that we are not thinking in silos, but we are really thinking in coordination with each other, because as you'll see, the issues that we're raising are really dovetailed with each other. So neighborhood health and safety has come up again and again, and it's addressed in all three lenses. And finally, we're concerned with looking at a productive land use pattern that can really leverage the existing and planned public investments that are being made. You saw all those investments that Ralph was showing that are already programmed, plus what could be done to the Scajaquada. These are millions of dollars of investment in transportation, in improvements to all the facilities in the park that Mike talked about. And we want to really be able to leverage those with other kinds of more efficient land use patterns. So these are all the things we're going to talk about. But before we go to the next slide, I want to point out that this map here shows that we are looking at individual neighborhoods as a part of the whole. And the reason for this is because these different neighborhoods have very different demographic profiles. They have different housing profiles. They have different mobility patterns. They have different concerns and issues around health and wellness. And we could not do our 360 review of the area and really dig in and understand what's going on if we looked at Region Central as though it was all one place. So we are really looking at all of the different kinds of places within Region Central to be sure that we're helping everybody. And that's what we're really trying to do with our inclusivity lens here, is to really know who's here, who's coming here, who's impacted by this, that, and the other thing, so that we can really measure those things and understand them when we start to look at the mobility scenarios. Next slide, please. So the inclusive lens, again, evaluates whether future mobility investments in Regional Central will support job accessibility for all, housing stability, and improve the health outcomes. And we have three goals that we are looking at here. I've really just touched on these already: supporting existing jobs, looking at new jobs, but we also are thinking about businesses. They're an opportunity for a lot of small businesses, both businesses that are run by new immigrants, run by different ethnic and minority groups. But also we have some interesting startups that are coming into the area that really reflect part of the innovation culture that Buffalo is trying to build. So we're really focused on jobs and businesses, a lot of small businesses, but then also thinking about the major institutions in the area that are also major job generators, but that can also support the goals around inclusivity. So of course, Buffalo State, the hospitals, the other smaller colleges. The zoo is a hugely important institution in this area. The art museums, these are all important institutions, and we want to be sure that they continue to be well integrated both into Region Central's economy, into Buffalo's economy, and to the region's economy. We want to really promote housing quality and neighborhood stability. And this is really the tale of two kinds of neighborhoods in Buffalo, in Region Central. There were the beautiful legacy neighborhoods that were built around Olmsted Park to take the Olmsted Park to really take advantage of that beautiful amenity. But then there was also a lot of worker housing, particularly on the west side, that was built to support all the factories and manufacturing that was in the area. And then the housing on the east side, which is where many African-American households moved and were able to become homeowners. So building assets and wealth. So again, really trying to understand the issues around housing, the role it plays in the life of the people who live in the neighborhoods, and how we can stabilize these neighborhoods over time. And finally, to facilitate community health. And I'll come back and talk about that as we go through each of these goals in a little bit more detail. So next slide, please. So in terms of supporting existing businesses, again, this map in some ways echoes the map that Ralph put up, where he was showing the major destinations within Region Central. And most of those are the places on this map that are connoted in the pink color that you see. And again, these are the major employers, what we call the anchor institutions, the economic generators. But as you see in the color in orange, we also are showing these corridors, these streets where there are legacy and historic buildings, the Pierce Aero factory. These places are all places that are also incubating activity. And we want to be sure that the mobility framework really supports these business incubators, if you will, because this is where we're really capturing a lot of small businesses and a lot of opportunity for households to also generate wealth. Not only home ownership is one issue, but business ownership is another way in which small and moderate income households are really starting to be able to get a foot on the ladder of economic mobility. And then finally, the gray areas, which are the vacant industrial and commercial properties. And as Mike already alluded to, some of these were large, very dirty manufacturing facilities that have been torn down, but the land is still there. And much of it has already been targeted for brownfield remediation through the BOA plans that have been done for this area. This is a resource we really want to be able to leverage to, again, really be able to grow the employment opportunities in Region Central. One of the things that we have noticed or seen in the data, again, and this is wonderful data that Ralph and the mobility team have been able to produce, is where people within these different neighborhoods commute. And we see that a lot of people on the east side of Region Central actually commute all over the region to the east. Very few of them have the opportunity today to work, or they might have the opportunity, but it's also difficult to get to what we're hoping will be a lot of job growth on the west. And people on the west commute often to the north. But they live in neighborhoods that are somewhat isolated and cut off, so it's hard to get from here to there. So these are the kinds of things we'll be thinking about so that we can really understand whether or not the mobility framework will be really helping to undergird and build up this employment framework, if you will. Next slide. When we talk about housing quality and neighborhood stability, we have done an enormous amount of work on understanding who lives in the neighborhoods, but not just who's there today. We have not looked at this as a snapshot. We've looked at Region Central as a dynamic place, what kinds of change has been happening over time. And in fact, a lot of change has been happening in some of these neighborhoods. For example, Black Rock has had the most population increase of any of these neighborhoods in Region Central. But on the east side, neighborhoods are losing population. These are the age of some of these households is older. But what's interesting is that they've been losing population faster, much faster than they've been losing actual households. So what that means is the number of people living in households is declining, but that the household themselves are not necessarily going away. But again, that could be because we have an aging population. So we want to really understand so we can help ensure that people will be stable. We know that big investments in placemaking, if we fix up and replenish the park system, if we make the Kajakwita work better, these kinds of improvements tend to also drive up property values. And we know that increasing property values create pressure on the lowest income households in the area, and they often get moved out to other places. And what we don't want to have happen here is that pattern of making big improvements and then creating the opportunity just for people who can afford it to start moving in, buying up property and living in this area. We've already seen a huge spike in property values in the Grant area. And you can see that in the areas that are starting to darken up. This map shows property values just as a measure or a metric, because property values in this case also track with a lot of other demographic features. And you can see where the values are on the rise by where the colors are either very dark or getting darker, particularly where they're adjacent to places where the values are relatively low. So again, we're trying to keep this in mind so that we can really try to figure out how to use these mobility improvements in a mindful way so that we're understanding both the benefits, but also the challenges that come with those improvements. And finally, next slide. We want to talk about healthy neighborhoods. Again, we heard over and over again from community members, particularly on the east side of the Skajakwita, that they were really concerned about issues related to air quality and traffic. And this was very much so in the area around the Humboldt Park Expressway, at Humboldt Expressway exit off of the Skajakwita, and also on Parkside, in the Parkside area, the Parkside exits. And the reason for this is partly because these are the two on-off ramp facilities for the expressway that go right into neighborhoods where people live. There's a lot of traffic that gets on and off Grant Street as well, but that's not going into neighborhoods where people live. So we really want to take into account the impact that the traffic getting on and off of the expressway has on local neighborhoods. It's an important variable. But we also define health and wellness as ensuring that people can get to the facilities they need to get to their daily needs. We heard people talk about food deserts and the inability to access healthy food. So we show where the grocery stores are, the existing grocery stores. We know that we're not going to be able to bring a grocery store to every neighborhood. This is a challenge that is endemic to every neighborhood in the country. But what we can do with the mobility improvements that we're looking at here is ensuring that people have better and more direct paths to the grocery stores that exist. Same with drugstores. We're also looking at health clinics and the access to at least urgent care. And then finally, can people safely get to schools? So we want to be sure that we're thinking about and elevating these issues as we evaluate all of the mobility issues. Next slide. We have a relatively short list of metrics here, 6 of them, but they're very important. One is, again, this idea to be able to better access current job concentrations and the large vacant parcels that we anticipate supporting new jobs. We want to be able to really see better connections between local households and the existing jobs of today and the potential jobs of the future. We want to be able to continue to support commuters coming from outside of Region Central to work in key industries, because we know that successful employment districts draw from large catchment areas for their workforce. And so although we are trying to look at this process in a 360-degree way, we also are understanding that the regions, that this Cajaquita serves a regional purpose. We want to spotlight the need to invest in existing housing quality while addressing affordability. Some of the elements of the mobility framework may or may not be able to directly facilitate this point, but if this point isn't discussed, considered and highlighted and really talked about as part of this process, nothing will happen. And people will not see the need to invest in housing as being happening in conjunction with, as opposed to following after all the mobility investments. Again, we'll be looking for better health outcomes, so we know that existing and future residents can get to the places that they need to take care of their daily needs. They can access healthy food and take care of their other daily and weekly household needs. And then finally, we want to really be able to use accessibility and mobility to increase property values, particularly on those non-residential, low-value industrial and commercial sites that could generate literally millions, and we've calculated this, literally millions of dollars in property tax revenues that could support essential city services. So with that, I'm going to stop and hand it over for the Q&A session.
Okay, thanks so much. At this time, I would like to ask if anyone on the call has any clarifying questions. So those would be questions about the presentations that you just heard, something that maybe you didn't understand, didn't quite catch, something you'd just like a little bit more explanation about. We have about 10 minutes for these questions, so we don't have a lot of time to go into depth because we want to get into our breakout rooms. But if you do have a question now, please go, you can type it in the chat or go to the reactions button and press the raise hand button. And I see that we do have one question from Alan, which says, what do you mean by low value parcels? Can you provide examples?
Yes, so I don't have all the data in front of me, and it's very extensive, the analysis that we've done, but we've looked at property values looking at the 2021, so these are very current, but we also looked at 2014 to capture the change over time. And what we saw is that the large industrial, vacant industrial parcels have a value of now I'm not remembering exactly, but just let's say about $7 a square foot, as compared to parcels, industrial parcels that have buildings on them, where the value is already twice that. And the value per square foot for occupied residential land is higher still. So these are unproductive properties that are vacant now and could be yielding a much greater property tax value for the city. I would also say of those big industrial parcels on the west side that they were primarily served by rail lines for moving goods in and out. And this is one of the reasons probably why they're still so underutilized, is because they're inaccessible. Many of them are inaccessible today without the rail. So this is one of the key issues that we want to be looking at.
Thanks, Dina. Also, we had a question earlier in the chat, and it was a question about what is the process for implementation of these ideas? And I was wondering if maybe David or Hal would like to touch on that.
Yeah, I'll chime in, and thanks for the question, Jolanda. This, unlike traditional projects where there's one project, one owner, and one big check, this will be a matrix, if you will, of projects with multiple ownerships. We've been doing that in recent years here, where we get a comprehensive answer and may have a variety of owners. We do need to get agreement from those that own those and find financial resources to make them happen. and then work together, meet regularly, and track the implementation process of doing that. GPNRTC is the Metropolitan Planning Organization, and really that's what metropolitan planning is about, the ability to bring governments, the public, and agencies together to cooperate. It's called the comprehensive planning process, and work together, again, identify the appropriate projects that everybody then agrees to, and stack the financial resources to get those projects done and sequence them so that we're able then to deploy them at the right time to get the right result as identified in the metrics here.
Okay, thanks. And there was a question in the chat that Dina just responded to. But basically, if you notice that there's something in a slide that doesn't look right to you, or for example, someone pointed out that maybe some pharmacies on grocery were missing from the slide, please do send those in to regioncentral@gbnrtc.org. I will type that again in the chat. We would love to get your comments and make sure that we can update our information. Okay, let's see. So we have a question, is whether Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper is involved with this project, and maybe Hal, you'd like to touch on how they've been involved?
Yeah, they were deep involvement, and we really recognize that the Skagit Creek itself is kind of the spine of this whole part of the region. So we worked with them early, they may be on the call tonight too, in terms of what their plan is, what their funding assumptions are, what they have stacked up in terms of existing funding, and how what we're doing with mobility and transportation facilities would work in concert with what they're trying to get done.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions? Oh, Yolanda asked second question, which is, now that the infrastructure bill is passed, what will the funding process look like for Western New York? And how can local community organizations tap into this funding to participate in the proposed projects and launch additional projects?
The new legislation is robust in terms of discretionary projects, which, you know, they've listened to us apparently and set aside initially $1 billion for these kind of transformative projects, which around the nation isn't going to do them all, but we can compete in that pool. There's other traditional sources that are substantially increased on the discretionary sides that we can take part of this projects and compete on that too. Plus the traditional funding sources in the transportation bill are substantially increased. So we can look at what part of projects that we need to get done that may be on, for example, surrounding arterials or other projects, and how can we then address those needs from the existing fund source, plus what things outside the transportation bill can we also bring to bear. We have other projects going now that have as many as 12 to 14 different fund sources in to get some of these peripheral components of the overall project done. So again, we build the big matrix and start building up the funding resources to get them all done. We can work with community organizations and some of the parallel initiatives we have going, such as the TOD project and others. We are working deep in the community now and trying to find resources to help bring the communities into the process, one, to support them, as well as have them help determine the nature, type, and sequence of resources needed to get some of these projects done. And I'm happy to come and meet with anybody and talk about how that might happen and how we can work together.
And also, will historically excluded communities be prioritized in regards to funding and projects?
The new federal legislation, that's pretty evident, and some of it is targeted specifically to do that. As we roll out these projects, we'll certainly look at how we can bring that forward and make it more competitive in the process, as well as deploy those resources to the most urgent needs and correcting some of the challenges that we've seen that David talked about in the early part.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we're trying to not have communities compete against one another, but work together so we can get a very comprehensive solution that's going to strengthen everybody.
I think just as a related note, I'm going to actually refer to Dina here. One of the things that she's been really helping all of us with is understand the kinds of recommendations that we should make to the city regarding the reuse of these former industrial parcels, because redevelopment itself is not a goal. The city's been very supportive of what Dina said, but redevelopment is not a goal in itself. New jobs, in their own sake, are not necessarily a goal in of themselves. It is inclusive economic development that's linked to training so that we bring the kinds of jobs that benefit those who need jobs and the training that gives them access to those jobs that are essential steps to realizing the full potential of making these sites more accessible. And I want to say the city is fully supportive of this perspective.
Okay, great. At this time, I would like us to go into our small groups. And so Charvi is going to randomly assign us to small groups. Thanks everyone for sticking with us up to this point. This is a time when you get to tell us what you think of the information that you've heard, and also give us comments, especially on those metrics that we've been talking about. And we look forward to hearing from you. We're going to spend just about 15 minutes in these groups, but I think that'll work because we won't have too many people in each group. So we're going to have those groups until 7:45, and Charvi is going to put us into those groups. Charvi, any words of advice for anyone?
No, you'll be automatically assigned to a respective group, like Nancy said. I see a question in the group that asks us, can we pick our own group? The answer is no, and all the groups are same. Just the facilitator and the note taker will be different. So,
okay.
And I just want to emphasize that all the information that we talk about in 15 minutes is going to be online, and think of this as a preview of the metrics that we'll be using to evaluate scenarios, so that, and you'll have plenty of time to comment on those online, if not tonight.
All right, let's go to our groups. Thank you.
Nancy, can I just add one quick
Sure,
technical
Hal.
note? We're having a little network instability in our offices, so it's kind of blipping out for about 20 seconds at a time occasionally. So if you're in a group and you're not hearing from us, perhaps a note taker could pick up at just the 20 seconds till we get back.
Yep.
Okay.
Or if you're having a lot of trouble in your group, go back to the main room, or and then Charvi will put you into a different group.
Okay, thank you. I'll pay the internet bill next time.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a productive time in your breakout groups. At this time, I am going to ask our facilitators to give a very, very brief 1-minute overview of some of the key issues that they heard in their group, so that we can just share what else was going on. So I'm going to start with Ralph. Ralph, can you give us a brief update on what you heard?
Sure. We had a relatively small group. We had a good conversation. I think it was more about making sure that folks understood the process and what these metrics were for. And I think that was a really good conversation. And people brought some, the right kind of attitude and ideas to that, maybe more so that, there was general agreement on the, maybe not the exact words that were in each of the metrics, but the intent of what they were measuring and how they were coming across. So, I think it would certainly benefit from a little bit more time and percolation in the community, but that we're on the right track here. And is, I think, sort of what we heard.
All right, thank you. David, let's go to you, David Dixon.
Okay, and I'll be very quick, and Jeff, please jump in and help me. But we had a robust and active group, small also, but had a lot to say, and I apologize for stopping in mid-sentence when we were moved back here. But I would say the real focus, if I had to pick one, is to make sure that when we use the word equity, we are real about it and substantive about it, that we convey, and this is my reading, but that people have a number of concerns around the ability to really tap the resources at Buff State around workforce and readiness and job training, about the ability to really expand opportunity, use these investments, the tremendous investment that will go into mobility to help trigger, and these are my words, but improvements to health, to workforce readiness, to economic opportunity, to maintaining the stability of existing neighborhoods, and the ability of everyone who lives in Region Central now to continue to live here, and therefore the importance of working with the city as a partner. And I emphasize the city has so far been a very willing partner in terms of those kinds of initiatives. The first question that was asked was, so how everybody probably largely agrees, and I have to say, people have been very consistent with what they said to us, no matter where they live and who they are. It'd be very hard put to find two people who have disagreed with each other, even people from very different walks of life, backgrounds, et cetera. So how do we take what is really a very large and strong consensus and make sure that it prevails in the end? Support Hal in working with the electeds, for example, frame our case in the most compelling way. Make sure we get everyone's help in doing that by reviewing our language with folks. There was somebody in our group who has started actually they are engaged, but a relatively new community-based group. How do we make sure that groups that not only existed when we started, but have started since we started, are engaged with us, and in part so we can get the right outcome, and in part so to support the right outcome, so that what we all work on together succeeds.
Thanks, David. Dina, let's go to you.
Hi, everybody. Our group was also felt that we were very much on track with the goals. We did not get into the details of the specific metrics, but people were very pleased that we were looking from the bottom up, not just from the top down in terms of the community's needs. People were very interested in multimodal movement across the region. Moving on to parks, one of the things that people said is that the area is really improving, but that they really is starting to improve, but that they really want to see the access to the creek and to the lake continued, and that they really see this as a health issue. So seeing the intersection between replenishment, mobility, and access to facilities as a health issue really resonated with people. So that was really good. One of the people in our group said this was her first time attending and that she was very excited with what she had heard so far. She is an East Side resident, and when I mentioned that the mobility guide shows that people who live on the East Side never travel to the West, not never, but rarely travel to the West Side, she said that is absolutely true. So good to know.
Great, thanks.
The inclusive development goals, people really also emphasize the need to think about displacement and gentrification, and that we really need to address that, but that there are neighborhoods that are really isolated, and we also need to address that. And then finally, somebody did really call me out on the fact that we're missing some pharmacies. And her reason for doing that was because she said she did not want her neighborhood to appear underserved. She said, serve the underserved neighborhoods, not my neighborhood. We're well served. So she's really echoing the point that David was making. So I want to really call out why that comment was made, why it's important, why I appreciate it, and why it will be heard and incorporated into the material. So thank you.
Thanks. Greg, can you give me 30 seconds on your group?
Sure. So we had a good group. First, I have to thank Breakout Room 4 because we ended so abruptly. I didn't get a chance to say thank you for participating, but we had a good discussion. We started with process. Everybody was glad that this process is reflecting what people want. We talked about mobility. Some of the high-level takeaways were considerations around bike access, safe bike access. One of the participants talked about biking in a snowstorm when he was whizzing by people in traffic. So, the importance of active transportation, access to transit, and making sure there's walkability as well was what we discussed. And then with regard to Dina's metrics and the inclusive development, people were very supportive of the goals, saying that they're on the right track and that racial equity should be at the forefront as we continue to move forward in this process. So again, thanks to Breakout Room 4. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Frank, how about you?
Yes, thank you all for participating. We also had a small group, but very active, and really appreciate it. We started out the discussion with a question really on how each of the individual lenses would be weighted, or if they were equal or one was weighted more over the other. We talked a little bit about that and whether some of these should be emphasized more than others, particularly on the park side, and how everything potentially could flow from that. We talked a little bit about the lenses and in some cases the subjectivity of the metrics and how we might deal with those. We talked about multi-mobility, making sure that we're including not just focusing on the automobile as we have in the past, but making sure that we're including all of these additional modes into the mix here, which we clearly are. We talked about quality of life and aesthetics as being important, and slowing traffic down to improve neighborhoods around them. So looking at this all inclusively and as a whole.
Okay, great, thanks. Mike Godfrey.
Yep, so we had some really good comments and questions, some rather direct ones, which we have noted. So to start with mobility, there was a question, sort of a request to have more aspirational related metrics, because they seem a little impartial right now, but they were requesting some aspirational ones. They also wondered about even calling it an expressway anymore, because it hasn't really been functioning as an expressway. Should we even be calling it an expressway? For the parks section, there was a lot of discussion about the Humboldt Parkway, the connection between the Lincoln Parkway and the Humboldt Parkway, and how really a decision is needed on the Humboldt Parkway in order to figure out what to do with the Skagit Expressway on the east side. That is very much needed. But the desire to have a connection between the Lincoln Parkway and the Humboldt Parkway was mentioned. For the inclusive development lens, there was a question about if we would be looking at sort of the future housing, 20, 30, 40 years in the future. 100 years was mentioned, which I think might be a little bit too far out there. And I couldn't quite remember, so I said we would document the question and answer it later.
Great. We just have a few minutes left this evening, and so I'm just going to ask the remaining facilitators to give their one highlight. And that Mike Davis, you're next.
All right, I'll go quick here. Wish we had more time, but for mobility, we talked about access and how access and choice interrelate, and how the central corridor is more of a funnel to the outside, not used much within the region. So, but there also talks about pedestrian access to parks, character needs to consider areas beyond the border, and vehicular traffic and access to parks. Changes in traffic on those smaller local streets not being equipped for it, factors like pollution, air quality, quality of life, and characters of those neighborhoods, and accessibility during those winter safety for pedestrians, four-season use. The quality of the creek, environmental restoration, and long-term process being very important, and private participation also being very important.
Great, thank you. How about Hal?
Comments on the importance of the creek and the surrounding creek area as really a linear park consistent with the original design, and how whatever we do here needs to be able to try and find a way to restore that. And also in terms of mobility, what about local access that is fed by 198 now, or accommodated by 198, and how can that be distributed in the grid and make it work? I assured them that we will be using our highly sophisticated dynamic simulation models to incorporate and understand that, as well as put in some of the new technologies to be able to move that and make it work best.
Okay, thanks. Amy?
We heard a definite interest in vehicle travel patterns and changes to that, as well as change in mode in the corridor. We heard also about bicycle connections and making sure that we're determining where people want to be able to go by bike, but maybe currently can't.
Thank you. And Kelly?
So I was also part of Amy's group, and I'll just pipe in and say interest in sort of future mobility options and what that might mean. And we emphasize that will largely have to do with mobility policies in the near term. And so the importance of incorporating that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Jeff, would you share our final slide again, please? So just to reiterate, we are recording this meeting, and so we will be summarizing all of your comments and putting them into our meeting summary. The presentation from this meeting will be available at gbnrtc.org/Region Central. On that website, there's also a place to submit comments. And at the bottom of that website, there's also an email address, regioncentral@gbnrtc.org. And we would love to hear from you. Again, here is the website on your screen, gbnrtc.org/Region Central. And under Connect with Us, you can leave a comment. You can also sign up to join our mailing list. Although all of you who provided your email address for this meeting tonight are now on our mailing list. Congratulations. We are hoping that our next meeting will be in person, and we'll give you a chance to look at some scenarios that get developed. But we appreciate all of your feedback and interest tonight, and for sticking with us through this long meeting, and hope that you have a great evening. Thank you so much. Hal, any final words?
I think we're running late. This is really important, and I really appreciate everybody taking the time to do this step. So when we start building scenarios, it's not just drawing some lines and hoping for the best, but we got a lot of time into this, and we want to get it right. It's going to affect this part of the region for generations to come. So appreciate your sound work on this.
And I'm going to say on Hal's behalf, I think he's also, I hope, building a coalition to support him in bringing what we do to success. So.
Okay, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful night.